Well, I got into diving, I guess, as a logical progression of swimming. My family was a great family of swimmers, so I learnt to swim when I was 4, which in the early 50s or the mid-50s was a pretty early time to be comfortable in the water to swim. I had a fascination all my life with shipwrecks, and that the swimming led into snorkelling and diving on the shipwrecks. And then when you snorkel over a shipwreck and can't actually go down and stay there, the next step is you need compressed air. So that led into many years of exploring, recovering artefacts from shipwrecks and looking for wrecks. So really comfortable in the water with diving.
So tell us about some of the wreck dives, some of them more memorable or fascinating.
The Lockard really sticks in my mind as being the most interesting wreck to dive on. I mean, the location off Muttonbird Island is spectacular. And because of the depth, it's in roughly 22 metres or thereabouts. Because of the depth, it's comparatively well preserved and doesn't have all the marine growth on it that the shallower wrecks have. So you can see it. You can work out parts and see bits of the cargo and swim under the plates and, go around like a wreck rat. It really is a memorable wreck to have explored.
What sort of things would you have found?
I guess the most exciting thing that I ever found was a diamond ring from the wreck of the Schomburg. It was lost at Peterborough in 1856, and the diamond ring was a pretty spectacular thing to have discovered. A real item of shipwreck treasure.
So, how was the famous Lockard peacock found?
No, the peacock was a very early thing. It washed up into Lockard Gorge shortly after the wreck in 1878. And a miraculous story that the packing case bobbed into the gorge. The workmen were working, salvaging stuff off the beach, and cracked open this packing case, and it had the life-size Minton peacock.
Yes, what other wrecks do you remember?
The Falls of Hallidale, an interesting wreck. It was one of the last of the sailing shipwrecks on the coast at Peterborough. Wrecked in the early 1900s. A huge ship. It was nearly 300 feet long. And the cargo there included roofing slate, and you can still see the roofing slate stacked in the hull. And we recovered, I can't remember how many tonnes, 20 or 30 tonnes of slate for use at Flagstaff Hill. So a lot of the buildings at Flagstaff Hill are roofed in that American slate that went down with the Falls of Hallidale.
Did you get any frights while you were wreck diving?
Not really. No, the frights tend to come later with the abalone diving, but the wreck diving was fairly routine and docile and lots of fun. Just a boy's adventure. It really was good fun, the wreck diving.
I could imagine. So how did you get started in abalone diving?
I'd always been interested in it. I'd been the director of Flagstaff Hill for quite some time, and was ready for a new challenge. There was a change in the legislation that meant the owners who, before that time, had to dive their own licences. There was a change that enabled them to have basically an employee contractor diver catch the abalone for them. So that gave me the opportunity to try it out, see what I thought of it, and that led to 15 years of it. So it was an adventure that was really another adventure. I knew nothing about it. I mean, I knew basically that, you went down, you picked up abalone, and that was what it was involved with, but had never done it before, had no experience with the industry, and literally went in green. My first day abalone diving was the first day I'd been on the deck of an abalone boat. So it was really in the deep end. But I did it for 15 years, 308 tonnes of abalone I caught in that time, which equates to about 1 million individual abalone and about 4,000 hours underwater. But the thing about catching abalone is there's only one way to do it, and that's one at a time. So 1 million abalone over 15 years, it's a slow, laborious task, and there's no shortcuts. You just got to chisel them off, pick them up, and put them in a bag.
So did you get any pointers from Lance?
Well, Lance was the deckhand. So the licence I worked initially was Dick Cullingwood's. And a real adventurous spirit. And as soon as he was able, he dived Julia Percy and Port Fairy, I think for over 20 years, but was keen to hand it on to someone else as soon as he didn't actually have to dive himself. So he tried another diver that didn't work out for the first season, and then I got a chance. And Lance had been the deckhand for Dick, and he was the master and I was the apprentice. Although one of the funny things about Lance was he couldn't swim. So you'd get near shallow water and he would literally shake. He was terrified of ending up in the water. But that made him a very good boat handler, because the last thing he wanted was to wreck the boat or have it fall out from under him. So he kept me and the boat safe, but I think largely because he didn't want to get wet. But a fisherman of great experience, a very, I think a character that you would only meet once in your life was Lance. Gruff, rough, but knowledgeable fellow, and underneath it a very soft heart. But you had to look hard to find it. But so he was the one that, taught me how to do it, basically. And we did well together. We did really well. So he was my mentor in abalone diving.
So it must have been a learning curve when you got on the bottom.
Well, it's interesting because the solitude of abalone diving is really one of the things you have to get used to. And I guess my fear was that it would be just terribly boring. And what I found, to my amazement, and it really was a profound discovery, that you'd be on the bottom, because you're really lying on the bottom, chipping off abalone, putting them in the bag. And then what I found was, when I finished that patch, I would almost instinctively move to where the next group of abalone were, as if I knew they were already there. And in kind of self-analysis, what I realised I was doing was subconsciously, as I'm chipping, scanning the bottom to see where to move to next as I'm chipping. And this became a completely automatic function. So as that unfolded automatically, I could then make up jokes. I could write letters to the editor of the local paper. I could do all sorts of things in my mind to keep myself entertained. I remember one day off Port Fairy, I was diving off Flat Rock, and I was working on this joke, which was, how do you make a Shih Tzu cross, was the gist of the joke, and coming up with all these punchlines. And I got back into the boat, because the trouble is, when you laugh underwater, the water gets in your mask and fills your mask with water, so you've got to control yourself so you don't laugh too much. So I get up to the back of the boat for a morning tea and a cup of coffee, and I'm just rolling around laughing. I'm sure the deckhand thought I'd gone completely insane, that you just come out of the water laughing your head off. It's like, what? I've been telling myself jokes. But the fact that you can do things subconsciously was an interesting discovery.
So you didn't have any problems with great whites at the island?
I had quite a few encounters with sharks, and they were all 7-gill sharks. And the 7-gill sharks would be attracted to the juice coming off the abalone bags there. They'd be excited to get something to eat. And they're not known as terribly deadly sharks, but they're a kind of shark that could actually eat you. They have the teeth capacity to take pieces out of you and make a mess. So they're not something that you'd fool around with. But my point was that when the encounters that I had with these sharks, when I saw them, I was never surprised. And I don't know whether it was some sixth sense that made me aware of their presence before I actually saw them, or whether it was part of this subconscious scanning where you kind of saw them and thought, oh yes, shark, and then when it came into your consciousness, then you kind of realised there it was. But as many encounters as I had, I was never surprised by them. And that was kind of an odd... And you'd get back in the boat, some of these encounters were really hand-to-hand combat, belting the things off. And then you'd get back in the boat, calm, cool and collected, and then the shock of what had just happened would sink in, and you'd start to tremble on the deck of the boat. But, luckily, 2 hands, 2 feet to survive all those encounters without a problem. No, I had an arrangement with them at Julia Percy Island where we would each mind our own business. I'd be crawling around the bottom picking up abalone, and you'd never look up. They were probably there far more often than I ever appreciated. But if you didn't look for them, you wouldn't see them. So that worked well for me. In the later years too, we had access to the Shark Pod, which was an electric South African device which basically sent an electric charge into the water to repel sharks. And then that was later enhanced by the Shark Shield Company, who refined it to a far greater level. But these things really worked. I know with 7-gill sharks, you would see them come into the field and you'd actually see them react to the electric shock. They do a flick, an arch, and just disappear. So the electronic repellent was obviously effective, and I never had any hand-to-hand combat issues with a shark of any description after I started wearing them. The downside of the electronic stuff was that if you went into a narrow canyon after Abalone, it would concentrate the electric zap. And where you'd get it is fillings in your teeth, which was a horrible sensation. The worst, though, the later model, the Shark Shield, was a long rat tail, we used to call it, about a 6 metre longer, 6 metre, thereabouts, quite a long tail that would trail off your air hose, and you'd never be aware of it. But when you surfaced, if the decky wasn't quick enough to pull the slack air hose in, you'd find yourself hitting the surface in a coil of not just the air hose, but of this rat tail. And with that thing around your head on the surface, it really, really would whack. You're getting electric shocks through your brain into your fillings. It can't do you any good. But, here I am. I'm kind of kind of aware and alert, but it was not a good experience with those things. But better than being eaten by a shark. In terms of the bends and the decompression stuff, it was a pretty... it was hard to be pedantic with it. It really was just... get it about right and see how you went. And my usual practice was a typical day at Julia Percy Island was you'd do 2 hours in 18 metres, which is as deep as I like to go. And then the rest of the day you would spend in shallower water, less than 10. And that system worked very well for me. And I think it was a matter of really almost trial and error, where you would... if that's what you did and you got away with it without any ill effects, well, okay, stick with that. There was a temptation to kind of stretch the rubber band and see how far you could take it. That's not something I ever did, but that served me well. I guess it relates to when I first started diving with, Dick kind of spoke about, what to do and where to go, and then under Lance's direction. In those early days in the 90s, it really was, it was a breeze. We'd go to Prop Bay, you'd anchor the old double ugly, you'd put the anchor up in less than 10 metres of water, let the anchor rope out so you'd hang in 18, and then you'd dive off the back of the boat on each side till you had your 2 hours, shorten up the anchor rope, and then spend the rest of the day in the shallower water around the anchor. So literally without shifting the anchor, you'd come home with half a tonne of abalone. And it's interesting, Dick's advice on that was, if you do that once a year, you can do it forever. And that really was a significant lesson. There was a tendency, you've had a good day, let's go back and clean it out properly the next day. Whereas the farming technique was, do it once, do well, but don't come back for 12 months. And in his advice, if you keep doing that, you can do that indefinitely. And that worked for many years until... things started to come unstuck a bit with the resource, and the thing that triggered it was the reef, the passage at Portland had been a bread and butter reef for the Portland divers for decades, and for whatever reason, over a period of a number of years, it got hit harder and harder and harder until it never came back, and it still hasn't. So this major productive reef, which had been a critical component of the Western Zone resource, was gone. And the effect of that was the divers who once relied on that then started to go further afield because they had to. That brought more divers to Port Fairy, more divers to Julia Percy. So whilst I might only dive that spot once a year, the problem was with other divers seeking better country, they would come in and dive those patches as well. And it was the beginning of serial depletion, which apparently is well understood in fisheries management. But that was the problem.
Obviously, if you haven't been bent, you haven't been narked. Narcosis?
That's true. Yeah, and generally not deep enough and not long enough. And in terms of the bends, I guess the only hint I had, to be honest, was doing my usual deep profile, and I'd done it for a few days, and we were going to Lorne with the family for a holiday, just a weekend in Lorne, and driving through the mountains. From Colac, Birregurra, you go up through the Otways and then down into Lorne. And driving through the Otways, I'm thinking, that shoulder feels a bit kind of iffy. Just like just the very slightest beginning of like a toothache in the shoulder. And I wondered what that was, got down into Lorne, it was gone. So, and they tell you not to fly after diving. So that's the nearest thing I ever got to any kind of warning about diving. The biggest risk too was, free ascents was something that they would warn you against. Coming up quickly from depth, and I had to do a couple of those with equipment failures in the early days, and did those without any problem. So you know 16 metres and bang, no air, and you know you just got to head for the surface, head back, breathe out all the way up, and no ill effects, and lots of swearing at the deckhand when you hit the top for whatever had gone wrong. You know those sorts of things. Like the first time it happened, Dick Cullingwood's outfit, the air fittings were all standard Ryco garage air snap connectors, and they work great in the garage, but when you're diving you can knock them loose. So, and no, in those days, no air backup, you're just simply running on the compressed air in the hose. Well, if this air hose fitting knocked off and you couldn't get at it, couldn't see what you were doing to reconnect it, then it was just instant loss of air. So that was my first real fright, Northeast Reef at Julia Percy Island. But what I when anything like that ever happened, I'd get home and I'd do a full analysis. You know, like OC Health and Safety was not invented yet, but like, okay, this was a near miss, what's to be learned? And obviously it was not using these stupid, you know, air fittings that were a hangover from the early days of ab diving when they dived with garden hose instead of proper air hose. So, you know, getting proper commercial diving fittings that locked on and couldn't accidentally release. And at the same time, I got a little bailout bottle, just a small air cylinder that I'd wear all the time on my back with a separate mouthpiece, so that if anything went wrong with your main air supply, you had a completely separate backup air supply. So I was kind of sensible about what I did as far as I could be, and just you know, taking heed of near misses and seeing what you could do with corrective action. It's funny, you know, following that near miss philosophy through, a few encounters with these 7-gill sharks, and all you've got's the abalone iron to fight them off. And I thought I'm going to escalate this defence mechanism, and I actually made a stainless steel sword that was in a scabbard beside the air bottle that had a handle on it, so you could actually jab the shark, but you could just pull it out from behind the back of your head, and you know, had a sword this long to try and defend yourself. Never had to use it. As soon as I put it in, I never had hand-to-hand combat again, which is probably a good thing.
Yes. So when you got an emergency ascent, and you've got to breathe out, of course, coming up, do you have to remember that, or would it just come automatically once the pressure started to build in your lungs? Would you automatically start to exhale?
Well, it's an interesting question with a free ascent, an emergency ascent, and one of the reasons it's taught so thoroughly in dive courses is that our bodies aren't designed to protect us from that danger. So we just don't have the innate instinct to release the pressure in our lungs, and in fact, your instinct is probably the reverse. You can't breathe, so hold your breath. And what that does, the air expands in your lungs, forces itself into your bloodstream, air embolisms, and you die. So it is really important to consciously be aware of making sure you breathe out, because we don't have that innate self-defence. The once or twice I had to do it, luckily was early in the day. If you had been, say, at the full 18 metres for my 2 hours, or even deeper for a longer period of time, if you did a free ascent then, I think you might not get out of it quite so easily, because apart from the air embolism, you've got the bends issue, and so a rapid decompression after you've been a long time at depth might be a different story in how you get over it. The other thing we carried, or I did, and I think most divers would carry oxygen on the boat. So you'd have a bottle of oxygen, and if you had a big day heading back from Julia Percy to Port Fairy, you'd just breathe oxygen through a regulator for 10 minutes or so, just to help with that purging of nitrogen. And that was recommended to us as just a kind of a sensible precaution.
What was your biggest fright diving?
It's funny, it's probably the biggest fright wasn't underwater. When I started diving with Lance, and the boat we had was a very early shark cat, and Dick and others, Dick and Len McCall, I think, were frustrated with the unreliability of outboard motors in those days. So to have two, 150, 200 horsepower outboard motors and having to maintain them and keep them running, I think they got a bit sick of it. So they both put Volvo Penta diesel engines in the centre of a shark cat, which is not something they were ever really designed to do, but that's what they did. The downside of that was that when you had a following sea, you're inclined to broach because you couldn't correct easily enough. You didn't have power on the corners of the boat to keep the thing straight. And once it started to go, it was very difficult to correct. The inherent thing in the early shark cats too was that although they were two separate pontoons, they weren't airtight and they weren't protected one from the other. So if you left one bung out of one pontoon on a shark cat, you would sink the entire boat because one pontoon would fill, go over to the top, that would fill, no buoyancy, bang, the thing goes to the bottom. So being aware of that made you a bit cautious about this particular boat. But so that in terms of frights, probably half a tonne. This is when not long after I'd started diving. So Lance at the helm, we had probably 400 or 500 kilos of abalone on, a southwesterly kicking up, so we dived the east side of the island where it was nice and calm. And then heading home, the chop got bigger and bigger and a slight diagonal. So Lance at the helm, hanging on with one hand onto the boat, the other hand onto the steering wheel, no hand free for the throttle. And this thing, the shark cat started to go and went sideways on the face of this wave and just kind of sat there and slid down the face of the wave and felt like it was going to tip over. It felt, I don't know how bad it really was, but it was terrifying because with all the weight, no buoyancy, it would have gone straight to the bottom. We had no access to flares, radios, no one knew where we were, what time we were doing it. It was just, this was a near-death experience. And we tried fiddling with shifting the weights of the abalone forward and back and, trying to trim the boat better. But the inherent problem was this centre diesel engine that once you lost the control of it, you couldn't pull it back up. And your only hope was to shut the throttle off. But you're hanging on to grim death just keep yourself in the boat. So that was terrifying and a good reason to get rid of Double Ugly. I was very pleased to have that pass on. I bought my own boat, which was a much, much safer vessel. And two, in terms of sensible follow-up, put in place procedures where we had mobile phones. We would phone when we were leaving Julia Percy Island to the home base with an ETA of arrival, so people knew exactly where we were, when we were expected to arrive. So put in place their own procedures just to check in and people know where we were.
So was the next boat a monohull or a...
It was a 24-foot Haynes cat. And the Haynes cat was built by Haynes Hunter they attempted to improve on the design of the old shark cat with advice from the Malakuta divers. It was broader in the stern of the pontoons so they could launch it off a beach and launch it in shallower conditions, and finer in the bow so that it would cut the water better. And it was a terrific platform with two 200 horsepower motors on it, a ton of abalone on board, no trouble at all. It was really quite a good and stable vessel. But because it had fine bows, it wouldn't punch. If you were going into a sea, the bows would simply cut into the wave nicely, but then the flat of the hull would just pound on the wave and would knock your teeth out. Whereas the old shark cats, because they had a planing surface front to back, they'd sit up on top and could go much faster in a rough sea. Their downfall, though, or discomfort, was that they were very wet. They'd suck. The spray they would throw front to back would get sucked into the back of the boat, so you get drenched, just travelling along in them. But, boats are a compromise, right? There is no perfect boat.
So you're working on almost a pristine environment. What are some of the more interesting interactions, perhaps, with creatures or observations of creatures on the bottom?
The seals used to be so entertaining at Julia Percy. It's interesting, might be that I used to have a lot of fun with the seals. Some frustrating, but a lot of fun. But when I started wearing the electric shark repellents, they were supposed to have no effect at all on mammals, and yet the seals would never come as close as they used to. But in the early days, I remember off Little Blowhole on the east side of Julia Percy, working in probably 12 metres of water. And the seals would often come around and they'd, for example, they'd grab the top of your wetsuit hood, bite it and pull it up and then let it go. Well, what that did, it'd pull up, fill with cold water, let it go with a whack, and it'd shoot cold water straight down the back of your neck. So they're nibbling at you. Never any malice. They're just playing and kind of sensing what you're doing, working out what you're doing. But you'd be working along the bottom, chipping off abs, and you'd have a row of like 4 or 5 faces there and 4 or 5 faces there. They're all just watching you like, what's this person doing? There was one day, one occasion, and it was only one seal that ever did it. It stuck its head in the bag, pulled out the abalone that I just put in there and dropped it on the floor, on the ocean floor in front. They wouldn't eat abalone, they wouldn't take them out of your hand. Picked it up out of the bag, dropped it on the floor in front of me. So I picked it up, put it back in. It got it out of the bag and put it. This went on to the point where it was ridiculous. We had this same abalone in the bag, out of the bag, one seal, just. So I finally had to give it a bit of a whack on the snout to get rid of it so I could get on with the day's work. But that was just, an amazing interaction. We had one day on the north side, beautiful afternoon, kind of getting ready to pack up for the day, and one jumped up. This is in Bubbles, so the second abalone boat. Got up on the back of the boat, climbed in, had a look around, went up into the cabin at the front, had a look around, came back out, and climbed up and perched on one of the outboard motors. Just sat on the outboard motors looking at it. We're just stunned looking at this thing wandering around our feet. But again, no malice. The bull seals were a bit scary. In season, you'd be working some of the shallow bays on the north side of Julia Percy Island, and they'd be above you, and they'd just make this grunting noise, hurr, 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 and you'd feel it in your chest because water about probably only 3 metres deep, and you'd be terrified of one taking to you because they'd like a lion. I mean, they'd make a mess if they really got hold of you. But apart from this kind of threatening grunting noise and swimming over the top of you, never any interaction with them at all, no problem. The starfish threat, particularly at the east of the state, was the guys regarded as a real threat to the abalone resource. So there are some divers who would collect the 11-armed starfish on the basis that they are predators of abalone, and they'd either kill them or take them home and kill them. My philosophy was they had more of a right to be there than I did, so I just left them alone. I mean, they'd eat abalone, but not enough to affect the resource in a natural environment. The thing I liked best about it was just the sense of adventure. We'd go out of Port Fairy most times, and you're standing on the deck of the boat, just cruising out through the river, the Moyne River at Port Fairy, heading out for a day's fishing. And I think for me particularly, I had a real sense of the heritage of it, that people had done this for hundreds of years before me, for different reasons, but this heritage of being a fisherman was something that I really loved. So you'd have the sense of that, the sense of purpose, the sense of excitement and adventure. And two, with the day's fishing, you kind of hope you're going to hit the mother lode. You hope, well, today's going to be, a ton day. This is going to be a ripper. Sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't, but just the unexpected. You'd never know what you're going to see. You'd never know what experience you're going to have that you haven't had before. It was just a kind of an exhilarating adventure, the whole thing.
What were the worst times?
The worst day I ever had, we were working out of Portland. I was working for a particularly ungrateful owner at that time, a woman who shall remain nameless, but trying to micromanage from a distance on what I was doing. I wasn't used to that. I mean, it's such fishing and abalone diving. It's such a solitary, self-managing pastime. To have someone trying to manage you from a distance over a telephone was not fun and not something I was used to. Anyway, it was the last day. We only had 300 kilos to get, and today's the day. It wasn't ideal, but we'll get out there and do it. And we worked at Cape Nelson, did a little bit too at Dutton Rocks, and had close to what we needed. We're probably about 50 or 60 kilos short, and the weather just got worse and worse and worse. And it finished up, the only place we could really get in was well up in the bay at Killer Waves, that kind of neck of the woods. And the water was filthy and couldn't find any abalone. And it took, I forget the figures. Let's say we had to get 30 kilos of abalone. I reckon it probably cost me took 2 hours to catch them. and it was miserable. It was cold, it was wet, it was surgy, it was dirty water. Plenty of abalone, but none size. And the end of that day was one I was very, very happy to have behind me. But it was really one of the. It's the only. It's one day in 15 years. It's one day that I thought was truly rotten. It was just a thankless, hard work mongrel day. But I reckon one out of all the rest. I mean, I used to say to people say, "Oh, you're abalone diving." And it's like, out every day. Oh, sometimes it's 40 days a year. It's like 40 days a year. What do you do with the rest of the time? Well, I was just, planning and preparation. It was a great lifestyle and great fun. I mean, just imagine making money that I'd never seen before and only working 40 days of the year.
Good.
Another question someone once asked me about the trials of abalone diving, and you must go out for long periods of time. These fishermen that are doing long haul. I said, yes, sometimes we're out all day. So my very first day's abalone diving, May 14th, 1992, on Northeast Reef at Julia Percy Island. And this was the biggest abalone I'd got for the day, and Lance was really impressed with it because he was a hard man to please, but he really liked the size of this one. And it was certainly on the first day to get a really good size ab. About 19 centimetres, legal minimum size then was 120, so it was a giant compared to other abalone of the time. The traditional abalone iron is just a chisel, and I used it on my first day and I didn't like it. That using the chisel, you'd have it in the palm of your hand to drive it in to get underneath the abalone, and then grab it and either twist it or pick it up to lever the abalone off. And it gave me a sore wrist. I just didn't like the ergonomics of it. So I immediately designed and invented this thing. And this I made in 1992, and most of my abalone, so this iron's probably caught, of my 308 tonnes, it's probably caught 250 of them, and just found it really good. So there's where you'd size the abalone. That's a good indication of the giant compared to the legal minimum length. So 120 millimetres was the minimum size in those days. The advantages, I mean, obviously this wrist strap was common to most, but having that so that it would fit in that part of your hand, you could actually drive the thing in under abalone, and most often that's all you had to do. You just slide that under them and they just pop off. Measure that, put it in the bag. The other feature, this hook, particularly working in surge where you're getting swept backwards and forwards across the bottom, to be able to just whack that in and hang onto a rock would keep you in the one place, and a sharp edge in there where if you had trouble with crayweed or seaweed generally, you could just cut it off easily and cut your way through seaweed. So that was the original style, and then towards the end I refined it further to this later model, which was adjustable for the varying sizes. You tighten the screw up when you had it in the right place, adjust that for the various sizes. But again, that provision for your hand in there where you could drive the abalone in. The beauty of it for me was, instead of having to lift up or down, it was just simply a rotation of the wrist, and that was enough to pop the abalone off. So I found it really useful, and that's the style of abalone iron I used all my career, really. I made these commercially, sold a few of them. Others didn't find them as good as I did. I probably sold a dozen or more, but others are quite happy with the old chisel design. But I found this particularly good, useful for the hand, protect the hand and wrist. So that was my little invention.
So how did working methods change over your time as ab diver?
When I first started diving, under Dick's direction and Lance as the deckhand, it was just simply fill a bag with abalone. It had a parachute on it which you'd fill with air. You'd either take the regulator out of your mouth and stick it in the bag and fill it that way, or you might have a little squirter that's attached to your airline. Fill the parachute, it would float to the surface. The deckhand would then pull on the air hose, pull you into the boat. That would get attached to the winch, empty the bag, give you a new bag, and off you'd go again. And in the early days that worked quite well because we're working at anchor, you're not getting far from the boat, and it wasn't a struggle to get you 500 kilos a day. It was pretty easy going. And then as the resource started to dwindle. Expectations of catch rates kind of increased. It evolved to having a number of bags which you'd accumulate on the sea floor and then float the accumulated bags to the surface. At one stage we were doing that 160 kilos at a time. That primarily was to minimise the number of ascents you'd do in a day. So you'd be down for an hour in 18 metres, collect your 160 kilos in 3 bags, float them all as one to the top, get the new ones and away you'd go. And then 2 things that changed. One was working live, where you wouldn't put the anchor down and the deckhand would follow you around. And then the issue was exchanging bags without having to do an ascent. And there are a number of ways you can do that. Just sometimes there'd be a weighted bag that would just simply be thrown on top of you. You'd start using that, fill the parachute on the other one and send it to the surface. The other system was to actually use the air hose with clipping points on the air hose where you'd attach the full bag, float it to the surface, and the deckhand would send an empty bag down on the same air hose, clipped to another fixed point. So there are a variety of ways of doing it, but that was far more efficient in terms of your catch rate per hour and enabled you to cover more ground, which was really the sad aspect. You had to cover more ground because as the resource thinned out, you couldn't just sit at anchor anymore because there weren't the sufficient abalone to make that system work. So there were a whole range of efficiencies that came to play from simply working at anchor 1 bag at a time through to when I finished. Working live was obviously a huge factor. The bag exchange was a huge factor. The other kind of sleeper in it was the use of GPSs. That working, for example, in Lady Bay in Warrnambool, where you're out almost in the middle of nowhere with very few fixed landmarks that you can kind of use reliably. And next we have a GPS which gives you a map of the bay and tracks of your GPS. You could plough it like you'd plough a field. It was just extraordinary. You'd go in the next day or the next year or a decade later, see your tracks and work on them or beside them. It was kind of like cutting grass. You just simply systematically work over an entire area of square kilometres. And whilst that was great for catching and catch rates, the impact of the resource again was magnified to the negative because there weren't many patches that were left behind and fully rested. So that the whole future of your resource then even more heavily relied on getting that legal minimum length right. And as we now know, 120 millimetres was not sufficient to protect the resource from overexploitation.
And so that would mask the actual depletion of the stock.
Absolutely. The improvement in the catch efficiency maintained and even increased catch rates, but exactly right, it masked the depletion of the stock up until the point where things started to collapse or people didn't go there anymore. Divers aren't silly. If there's a patch that used to be productive but no longer is, well, they'll fish other areas, which means you get no data from an area that's now collapsed. Well, you kind of had an expectation of for a day's work. You had a rough expectation of what you would aim to get for the day, and subconsciously you knew how many bags you should be sending up over a given time to maintain that. It's funny, one of the earliest lessons I had to learn, and it was Lance, the deckhand, who drove it into me, is if you're not catching fish, get out of there. Don't persist. Particularly when you're working at anchor. It's like if the abalone aren't thick enough to ensure anywhere near a reasonable catch rate, don't keep swimming in optimism. Hit the surface, get back in the boat, and we'll go somewhere else. And that was a point Lance used to drill into me, and was really wise counsel in those days. That really perseverance on barren ground was not sensible. It's very unlikely that you're going to be on dodgy ground and all of a sudden hit the mother lode. There'll be signs of it before you hit really intense areas, but if there's nothing there, get out of it and move to another spot. The only thing I'd add is that in I think the greatest disappointment in my time as an abalone diver was to realise the uselessness of marine biologists and government departments in trying to manage fisheries. I'm a conservationist at heart. I would never have consciously taken part in the raping and pillaging of a resource. I just wouldn't morally do it. And yet that is to some degree what happened, and the reason it happened was because of reliance on marine biologists and bureaucrats who were not worthy of that reliance. They were, I think, cowardly and impotent in how they tried to oversee the fishery, and I remain bitterly disappointed in their performance. They were a disaster, and it was only the good intentions and the good sense of fishermen that gave the resource any hope of surviving in perpetuity.
Two or three times a week you'd think you were going to die.
So you had to force yourself to live.
But when the water was murky, though, you didn't know what was coming.
Came back at me flat out and smashed me into the bottom, so like really hard.
In Abalone Diving, Tasmania, we hear from 15 people who were intimately involved with the fishery from its beginnings in the early 1960s till the present time. This DVD runs for over an hour. They tell us of hard times, but also the good times before quotas were introduced, when money flowed like water, the days of wine, women and song.
You know, the ego was the thing, you know, and then there was the wanton waste of money, whether it was just on ridiculous things, cars, sound systems, stereos, wives, multiple wives, guys just losing money because it all came too quick, too easy.
The divers were daily immersed in the natural world, and most of it was pristine. They speak of the hazards of the bends, nitrogen narcosis, and interaction with sea creatures from parrotfish, octopus, seals, dolphins, orcas, and of course, sharks. For all the dangers and risks involved, few would have had it any other way.
You know, working with a group of fellows, particularly when the weather was fine around there in the summertime, it was absolutely magic place to work in the summertime. You know, no swell, you know, some days were absolutely glorious, really.
We really had a great life. We just should have had more time to enjoy it. We just went and worked and worked.
Great times, Garry. Wonderful life.
Available from Boat Books Australia on 029 439 1133, or from the Maritime Museum in Hobart on 03 6234 1427, and all good bookshops.